It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. In our program today, we return to the momentous events of American history in the second half of 1963. The Great March on Washington, D.C. in August of that year, the legendary I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the actions of President John F. Kennedy on civil rights in the turbulent months leading to his assassination on November 22nd, almost exactly 50 years ago. In the most conventional telling of recent history, President Kennedy is often depicted as a great pioneer of civil rights, the architect of the social changes that ended segregation and reshaped American life by the beginning of the following decade. Yet the story is much more complex, and Kennedy's civil rights legacy is less clear. His response to the March on Washington is a telling example of very conflicted views that today might surprise many Americans. Our guest is William Jones, a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a scholar of civil rights and labor history. This year, he published The March on Washington: Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. Let's talk about Kennedy for a few minutes and set the context somewhat. So Kennedy runs for president in 1960. Does not particularly talk about civil rights very much. It's not entirely clear what his views are in the course of that campaign. But then once in the White House, he still doesn't do a whole lot on civil rights in the first years until, as you say, in '63, he finally introduces this rather tepid civil rights legislation. But where was Kennedy in civil rights at the time? And what was the perception, as you understand it, of him from the key civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King? And what did he think of them?
You know, civil rights leaders were optimistic with his election. They thought that he was somebody, he spoke in bold terms about reviving American liberalism, and they saw that as promising. At the same time, he was very reluctant to support particularly demands around the enforcement of civil rights measures in the South. He depended on his election as a Democrat largely on votes from white Southerners, and so he felt that he was sort of caught in a bind on that. And it's true that, I mean, we have to remember how strongly committed Americans were to the system of segregation at the time, and not just Southerners. In the North, in fact, Kennedy, his polling ratings declined when he supported civil rights measures, and people, overwhelmingly, whites in North and the South said they felt that he was moving too quickly on civil rights, even at a time when most of the civil rights leaders were saying this guy's not doing a thing. So he was really caught, and there was a real political, I think, challenge that he faced in how to deal with, in a sense, a country that was very torn and, if anything, sided with segregation. The real important factor in pushing him to take a stronger hand was civil rights activism. So the introduction of the initial bill came in the wake of the really violent attacks on protests in Birmingham, the scenes that many of us have seen of people being attacked by police dogs and fire hoses, often very young children. And this really forced Kennedy's hand. That, I think, was also a position that I think it was important, a reflection of his position with the civil rights movement. He saw the civil rights movement as forcing him to do things that he didn't necessarily want to do. And so I think his attitude toward the Birmingham protests were, you know, this is a liability for us. Right after his election, he was confronted with the problem of the crisis that was created by the Freedom Rides, these young activists going into the South on segregated buses and challenging integration. And his response to the Freedom Rides was get them to stop. Right? He told people who were close to the movement, you need to stop this. This is embarrassing us. He was in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a moment in which his initial reaction was, this just needs to end. And that was actually, in fact, his response to the initial move to organize a march on Washington. He called all the leaders of the march into the White House, and ordered them to call off the march. Interestingly, when he did that, he called Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph, who were the principal initial organizers of the march. He also invited Roy Wilkins and Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers Union. Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP, and Walter Reuther, actually, they opposed the march at the time, often on similar grounds as Kennedy. They thought that a large, particularly a march that may turn violent, like they had seen in Birmingham, this would make it impossible to pass a civil rights bill if you had a scene like that in Washington. And so Kennedy actually called them to the White House with the hope that they would help persuade King and A. Philip Randolph to call off the march. That backfired in a way. Kennedy wasn't actually convinced in that meeting, but after that meeting, Roy Wilkins and Walter Reuther both endorsed the march. And they were largely convinced, I think, by the counter-argument from Martin Luther King and Randolph, which was, we already have violence around civil rights. We have these protests in the South, and they're getting attacked. We have these scenes of violence. We need to do something that will make a dramatic and nonviolent statement, and do this in a way that can project a positive image of the movement. And I think actually Kennedy was convinced by the time the march occurred. I think his embrace of the march, his willingness to meet with leaders of the march afterward, I think reflected his realization that this actually was an effective way to do politics. He thought that this was not going to be effective, and he was shown otherwise, I think.
One thing I'm curious about, 200,000 people marching in Washington, D.C. is sort of a dime a dozen event now.
Right.
And you've got to get 1 million people to Washington, D.C. for anybody to really acknowledge that that was a big event. And so what was it about the notion of 200,000 African Americans and their allies of other races arrive in Washington, D.C.? Why was that? And initially the idea was 100,000 or even fewer in some of the discussions. Why was it that that would be such a dramatic thing, either such a threatening thing or such a powerful message?
Right. Well, I think, and this is something that is sort of the broader history that I tell in the book about the way in which this was actually first proposed in 1941 during the Second World War by A. Philip Randolph to address employment discrimination in the armed forces. And in that case, President Roosevelt actually did succeed in convincing them to call off this march, largely on the same grounds. He felt that this would make it impossible to make any grounds in Congress on civil rights measures. And so he issued an executive order that addressed the problem of employment discrimination temporarily and in a very weak manner, but he convinced them to call this off. This had been an idea that had been talked about for a very long time, and particularly Philip Randolph had kept pushing for this idea. And when they did that in 1963, the fear of this event still remained the primary story. So if you look at the news coverage, for example, before the march, the primary story is Washington is preparing for a siege. Washington has called out troops. They had troops staged across the river with helicopters ready to bring them into the National Mall in the event of a riot. They moved all of the prisoners out of the prisons in the city in anticipation of filling them up with protesters. And this was the main story, and the one that I think for most of people in power, including Kennedy, was the primary fear. You know, this is what had happened in Birmingham, and everybody knew it wasn't that the protesters were violent, but they had provoked a violent reaction in large part because they were demanding things that were extremely controversial and at the time. And so I think the power that the march had was largely dependent upon that fear and the idea that this could be something terrible. Nobody really knew it was going to happen. I have a picture in the book of a political cartoon depicting the marchers as a fuse leading up into a powder keg. This is a disaster waiting to happen. And then the surprise that there wasn't any violence and that this was actually a tremendously effective sort of image of what the civil rights movement was, what these civil rights leaders wanted, what supporters, this interracial support that it gained. So it ended up being a tremendous public relations feat but only because it was so threatening. And so in a sense, it was the kind of thing you could only really do once, right? So now, repeating it, everybody knows that you can bring that many people to Washington and they won't riot. But at the time, that was the primary concern.
In your book, you argue that we have collectively misremembered the March on Washington in 1963, particularly with our obsession with Dr. King's dream speech, with a mythological, perhaps an overly joyous, overly positive recollection of what happened in the March in 1963 and the events leading up to that. But tell us what you mean by that, by this misremembering of it, and why does it really matter if we remember that march and that event in a way that is perhaps more singularly positive than what you would say all the dimensions of that day in history were?
Right. Well, I think that part of our misremembering of the march is to treat the march as a sort of snapshot, as a one day. And forget the very long history that, as I trace in the book, goes back to the 1940s and even before that, the preparation for the march. But I think we also forget the march, or we narrow our conception of the march. I think most of us know the march through Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which was a tremendous speech, the most powerful and lasting speech of that day. And for good reason. Martin Luther King was in that position because people recognized that he was going to give a tremendous speech. But what we forget was that it was the last of 10 speeches given that day. And in many ways, because it was the last, it was the least specific about the actual goals of the march. So the themes that he touches on in his speech of interracial reconciliation, of interracial cooperation, were important sort of broad themes of the march, but they were not the specific demands of the march, which were laid out very clearly by the 9 speakers who preceded King. So in focusing on King, I think we sort of get the energy and the passion of that speech, but we really don't get much of a sense of what the march was actually about.
Well, and I want to hear more about that and what you mean by that. I know that I think it was Jesse Jackson who I first, many years ago, heard complaining about the notion of what he called the harmless dreamer, the way that we'd come to view King as the harmless dreamer, as this person who just had this beautiful vision for the future of America, but nothing else. And is that what you mean, in a sense?
Well, I think there's a certain degree to which that's true. That I mean, even if we look at King's other speeches, the speeches that he gave before and after that, they're much more hard-hitting. But his primary goal and his primary task that day, as the last speaker, was really to uplift people after a very long day. He spoke about 2 hours into a very long program that was preceded by an actual march. Most of the people there had spent the night on buses. They had traveled a long time. And so his task there was really an uplifting keynote address. The official program for that day began with A. Philip Randolph, who was actually the official leader of the march. He had actually first called for a march on Washington 20 years earlier in 1941. And his primary goal that day was not just to pass a civil rights bill that President Kennedy had introduced several months earlier, which focused primarily on integration and voting rights in the South, but A. Philip Randolph's primary goal was to add to that bill a fair employment clause to address the issues of job discrimination, which surveys showed was actually primary in the minds of most African Americans at the time, and was certainly the primary objective that was bringing that tremendous crowd to the march that day. One thing that I think is fascinating, if you look at the full range of the speeches, is the degree to which they hit over and over and over again on a central theme that A. Philip Randolph began with, which was that racial equality was never going to be achieved without a broad program for economic justice, and one that would benefit not just African Americans, but all Americans. And all of the speakers touched on that over and over again. And the New York Times, actually, the day after the march, noted that it was somewhat ironic that Martin Luther King, who had been really, of all the speakers, really in the heat of the struggle, his house had been bombed several times, there were death threats against him. He was the one who gave the most forgiving and sort of optimistic speech of the day, while the others, as the New York Times said, the others concentrated on the struggle ahead and spoke in very harsh language. And I think we need to really, understand and remember King's speech, but understand it in the context of those other speeches.
And what were some of the other demands beyond just the notion of economic justice or economic equality? What else was being pushed?
Right. Well, I think it's also important to remember and I want to talk more about Kennedy today, but that Kennedy had introduced a civil rights bill 2 months before this march. And so the goal of the march was, on one hand, to build the political support to pass that bill. But perhaps more importantly, it was to strengthen that bill. And the measures aimed at strengthening the bill were aimed at federal enforcement of integration, desegregation of voting rights. They wanted to withdraw federal funding from any local governments that discriminated against African Americans. They wanted to limit congressional representation in any state where citizens were denied the right to vote. As I said, the most important demand was to add a fair employment clause to the Civil Rights Bill. This would actually become Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and was a measure that Kennedy at the time of the march did not support. In addition to those civil rights measures, they wanted a broader agenda of economic justice, which included raising the minimum wage. They wanted to raise it to $2 an hour, which in today's terms would be roughly $15 an hour. They wanted to extend the minimum wage to cover all workers. At the time, agricultural workers, domestic workers, public employees. These were the employment sectors that were most important for African Americans. All of them were excluded from the federal minimum wage law. They wanted a job creation and training program that, as they said, would place all unemployed workers, black or white, in decent and family-supporting jobs.
So much more economic, much more labor-oriented issues than
right.
Content of character and integration of schools and available to voting.
That's right. And I think also importantly, they made a very close connection between those goals. They said, we don't want one or the other. These things cannot really be achieved in isolation.
And what was Kennedy's, before that happened, before it all turned out well, what would Kennedy have said, and your book's not primarily about John F. Kennedy, but I think this is a critical aspect of it. What was the agenda that he would have preferred? He introduces this lesser Civil Rights Act, but
right.
what was his message to the organizers of the march as to, in the beginning, what would be the preferable course of pursuit?
Right. And this is, I think, really important in terms of understanding the legacy of the march and the effect of the march, because there's a considerable debate about, did the march end up passing what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And of course, Kennedy had introduced this law. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson said, we need to pass this in a way of honoring Kennedy. But I think what's important to remember is that they ended up passing a law that was very different from one that Kennedy had proposed and one that Kennedy had supported. And I think the principal difference was understanding civil rights and the civil rights agenda as something that was a national and a sort of a broad, both economic and racial issue. For Kennedy, civil rights was primarily a Southern issue. It was primarily focused on legal equality, voting rights, the access to the vote, access to public accommodations, again, primarily in the South. And he was actually, one of his arguments about the equal employment measures of the bill was that this would actually alienate Northern conservatives who didn't have a problem passing a law that would end legal segregation in Alabama or give people the right to vote in Mississippi. But they were particularly not going to support a law that would tell a private employer what they could do in a hiring decision, right? That this was something that would not fly among Northern Republicans. And I think, and in many ways he was right. I mean, that was a big sticking point. But what the march did, I think, was to make the argument that, as A. Philip Randolph said, in his speech to the march, it's fine to give somebody the right to eat in a restaurant, but that doesn't mean anything if somebody doesn't have a job and can't afford to eat in that restaurant, to pay for their meal. And I think that central message, which was really the central message of the march, that the two things cannot be separated, was something that was not really on Kennedy's agenda. Kennedy talked about economic policy in ways that were completely separated from civil rights policies. And I think you can see, the effect of the march really came to fruition in Lyndon Johnson's administration after the assassination. And I think you can see very much that fusing of these two issues that came directly out of the march.
And Kennedy certainly couldn't have imagined what would later come in Boston and places that he knew well of efforts to combine black and white students into public schools through busing and those kinds of government intrusion into the creation of ultimately not all that successful creation of an integrated society. That was not the sort of ideal that we have any reason to believe he was imagining.
Certainly not. I mean, the issue that really came to a head in the months after the march was the issue of housing discrimination, and it was primarily around housing discrimination in northern cities. There were efforts to pass laws prohibiting landlords and sellers from discriminating in purchasing and renting housing. And again, this was an issue of what a private, what a landowner could do. Another point that A. Philip Randolph made in his speech is that we need to challenge the idea, he said, that somebody's private property rights can transcend the value of a human personality. And again, this is a very radical position, right? And one that Kennedy would have not associated with the issue of sort of upholding legal equality in the South.
And it's worth remembering exactly what is happening around all of this in this period of time. As you've just already described, the things that had occurred in the South with the Freedom Riders and the violence against them, and really the Kennedy administration's struggle to figure out what to do about that or how to become involved. Bobby Kennedy negotiating arrangements with the state of Alabama that then the state ignores, and more people being badly injured. It's sort of a messy first years of the administration on civil rights. And then on the night that Kennedy announces his support for the Civil Rights Act in '63, Medgar Evers, the NAACP leader in Mississippi, is gunned down in front of his children and wife. And then the march does happen, and weeks later, the 4 little girls in Birmingham are killed at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and then 2 months after that, Kennedy himself is dead. And so it's an astonishing kind of sequence of events in the context that he was dealing with. Why was it that when the day of the march finally came, why wasn't it a violent event? I mean, there were neo-Nazis there, or
That's right.
people trying to make trouble. Why didn't it go bad?
Yeah, I mean, this is really I think a remarkable story, and it's one that I think needs to be taken seriously. Why? I mean, as you said, the American Nazi Party applied for a permit for a counter demonstration on the same day in Washington, and they were denied that permit. The leaders of the American Nazi Party actually ignored that denial and encouraged members to go to Washington and essentially taunt people into violence. So they stood on street corners and yelled profanities at marchers, trying to provoke the violence. And again, I think they knew that, if there was any violence at this event, it was going to be blamed on the civil rights movement. And they knew that this would be a perfect way to discredit it. And the lengths to which the organizers of the march went to ensuring and explaining to people who participated that dynamic, why it was so important for this to be a nonviolent event, were really remarkable. The single most important person in all of this is Bayard Rustin, who was the associate director of the march. He had worked very closely with A. Philip Randolph since the 1940s, and was the person in the United States probably most familiar with the tactics of Gandhian nonviolence. He had actually gone to Montgomery, Alabama in the mid-1950s and trained Martin Luther King in these tactics of Gandhian nonviolence. And one of the things that he talks about when he first met Martin Luther King is Martin Luther King had armed guards on his rooftop. He had guns lying around his living room. I mean, his house was being bombed. He was under constant threat. And Bayard Rustin had to explain to him, if you're going to lead a nonviolent movement, you need to get rid of the guns. You need to. I mean, and these are, this is an understandable response. I mean, I think many of us would respond in the same way as Dr. King did. But Bayard Rustin encouraged him to take what was in many ways the unexpected response, which was to not embrace violence as a response. He organized the delegations of the march and went into minute detail about how to ensure that people understood what the goals of the march were and what the tactics of the march were. People were actually encouraged. Many people went to the march individually in their own cars. They were encouraged actually not to do that. The official request was to go in a train or in a bus, to go in a group. Every bus, every train car had marshals on them that were to explain to all of the passengers what the goals of the march is, explain to them the tactics of nonviolence, to ensure that people felt like part of a group, that they did not get sort of bored. They actually, the train from Chicago had a jazz band on the train, and the organizers said the reason for this was to combat boredom. They didn't, they wanted people to feel engaged and part of a movement. Bayard Rustin insisted on getting a $20,000 sound system. Apparently, they could have gotten a sound system that would work for about $5,000. And he said, I want people to be able to hear every word if they're standing at the foot of the Washington Monument, so over a mile away. And he said, the principal goal of this is to keep everybody engaged. He said, we want to turn this crowd into an audience and give them something to engage with. And so I think the fact that there wasn't violence is actually, I think, an important and remarkable achievement, and largely due to this really meticulous foresight on the part of the organizers.
Well, and the irony, of course, as well, is that Bayard Rustin was one of the named figures that the Kennedy folks said needed to be tossed out before the march occurred. Right?
That's right. That's right. And I mean, and I think A. Philip Randolph's response to Kennedy was like, wouldn't you rather have somebody who really knows a lot about nonviolence leading this march than somebody who doesn't really know about nonviolence?
And why was it that the Kennedy administration wanted him out?
Well, it was actually, the primary opposition came within the civil rights movement. It was actually Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP, objected to having, and his objection was the initial proposal was to actually have Bayard Rustin be the director of the march. And he objected to that on a number of grounds. One, Bayard Rustin in the 1930s had belonged to the Young Communist League. This was something that they felt would be a liability. During the Second World War, he had been arrested for draft resistance. He was a pacifist. He grew up in a Quaker community and opposed war on principle. And so he was thrown in jail for resisting the draft. And in the 1950s, he had been arrested. He was a fairly open homosexual, and he had been arrested for having sex with a man in the 1950s. And all of these things were seen as the director of the march should not have these sort of liabilities. A. Philip Randolph, who, again, knew Bayard Rustin very well, had tremendous respect for him, agreed to a compromise, which was essentially he said, well, I'll be the director. And everybody agreed to that. They couldn't say no to him. And then he said, and my associate director will be Bayard Rustin. And it put Bayard Rustin not in the position of being the official representative of the march, but the person who was in charge of the day-to-day activities of the organizing.
It ends up on the cover of Life magazine, right?
That's right. And this is something that I think is important about our memory of the march. The memory that we have now is actually not the image that most people had of the march watching on television. The march it was very clear if you watched it on television, if you read any of the news coverage the next day, that the goals were of these two objectives of jobs and freedom, and that the leadership was primarily A. Philip Randolph. Bayard Rustin was important in the leadership. The Life magazine cover shows Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph standing on the cover. You have to go about 20 pages into the magazine to get a picture of Martin Luther King. So the image at the time, I think, was actually, and that's something that I think was a success of the march, projecting a very clear message that was not distorted by the media at the time. I think in our memory it's been distorted.
And then, and I want to back up in time in a moment, but before we do, at the end of the day, the march has succeeded and people are filing back out of the city. And I guess this was another element of the plan, was to adjust the schedule in such a way that everyone would arrive that morning and then be back on the trains and buses and out of the city by nightfall.
That's right.
But so this is finally all finished. over at the White House, there's great relief and a bit of amazement, I guess, at how things had turned out. And Kennedy sends word to the organizers to come see him that night. And they arrive after this long day, not having had anything to eat all day, and arrive at the White House to meet with him. What's Kennedy's reaction at that point, and what's the conversation that happens between them?
Yeah, another funny anecdote is by A. Philip Randolph's first demand was actually he asked for a glass of milk, because he was 74 years old at the time, and he had spent the entire day. He had actually gone to Congress in the morning, met with congressmen, had a fairly hostile response, or a sort of ambivalent reception from Congress. He had then gone to the march, participated in the march, spoke, and then at the end of the day, they come. Kennedy, I think, was elated at the success of the march. I mean, he praised Martin Luther King for his speech. He said, and I think by that point was really convinced that this had been a tremendous sort of media success, and that it would affect that it would make it easier, I think, to pass the bill that he had proposed. There was quite a bit of sort of discussion at the time about whether it would affect the bill.
But I think his ratings were going down at that point already because of his support, right?
That's right. His ratings plummeted right after he introduced the bill. And again, this is when these polls were showing increasingly that people thought he was moving too quickly. At the same time, the approval ratings for Barry Goldwater, who at the time was the sort of upstart conservative candidate for the Republican nomination, his poll ratings were going up, largely as a reflection of his opposition to Kennedy's bill. And he would ultimately secure the Republican nomination and in some ways set up a presidential competition that was in some ways a referendum on what had been Kennedy's bill by that point. It was the bill that Johnson was putting forward.
Though we can't know really what because of the assassination, and it's sort of pointless to speculate, but it is interesting to wonder what would ultimately the Kennedy agenda have been in the aftermath of the march, and to what degree he was affected by it or was not.
Yeah.
But we'll just never know on that, because Lyndon Johnson becomes president and then embraces the bill, strengthens it even further, as you said, and then also presents it as a referendum on Kennedy, in a sense, the passage of it.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And Johnson, Johnson, I think, is a really fascinating and sort of unexpected figure in all of this. That when he came into the White House after the assassination, civil rights leaders were horrified. They said, here we're exchanging this liberal Northerner for this white Texan who he was credited actually with helping to pass a very mild civil rights bill in the late 1950s, but part of that was the question was whether it had passed only because it was just sort of watered down so much that it didn't have any effect. Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP, said the civil rights, our progress on this bill is dead. It's over, and we're never going to get anywhere. And he was, I think, one thing that they didn't anticipate, I think, was actually the way in which the economic aspects of the March on Washington's agenda, and the argument, I think, specifically that civil rights and economic justice went hand in hand, resonated with Johnson's experience, his background with his own politics. And I think in some ways that was why he actually ended up championing the economic aspects of the March on Washington much more than Kennedy, because he came from not a poor family, but he had experienced economic deprivation in which, in a sense that Kennedy had no personal experience with. He had been a school teacher in rural Texas with a predominantly Mexican-American student body. He understood the connections between segregation and poverty and the effects of poverty. And I think that made him much more sympathetic to this agenda. And a really fascinating, I think, set of occurrences are the meetings that he held with civil rights leaders in the White House, in which he asked them about what do they want. And half of the meeting was them talking to him largely about economic justice and about the need for jobs. And then the last half of the meeting would always be him lecturing them on how they were going to get the bill through Congress and schooling them in politics. And I think it was in many ways an unpredictable but a very important relationship.
Let's jump back in time now, because I think one of the most interesting things about your book is that you bring to the forgotten history part of the subtitle is this account of a civil rights movement that begins a lot earlier and is a lot more complicated than the way we typically remember it. So much about these events is misremembered, I think. But that most Americans, I suspect, would say that the civil rights movement started sometime in the 1950s, that it was mostly organized by the NAACP and Martin Luther King, the Brown v. Board of Education decision ending school segregation in the 50s. Rosa Parks is in there somewhere. Then there's the March on Washington, and that's the story of the civil rights movement. But your story goes back to the 1920s. You position A. Philip Randolph as the central figure at a much earlier stage. The civil rights movement is much more a political and really ideological movement, more aligned with labor organizations, socialism, to some degree communism at different points in time. But tell us who A. Philip Randolph was, and draw some picture for us of that different origins of the civil rights movement.
Right. I mean, the story that I tell really focuses early on A. Philip Randolph, who was a labor leader. He was a socialist. He was actually a native Floridian who moved to Harlem just before the First World War and became involved in the socialist movement in New York City during the war. He emerges as a leader, as a sort of recognized leader of African Americans, largely in the 1920s as a union leader, the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, which was a largely African American union, largely organized by workers who were excluded from the larger white-dominated and explicitly white supremacist railway brotherhoods. His real sort of broader recognition came in 1941 when he first proposed a March on Washington to combat employment discrimination by defense contractors and discrimination and segregation within the armed forces during the Second World War. And his argument was that President Franklin Roosevelt was arguing at the time the U.S. was not directly involved in the war, but Roosevelt was arguing that the United States had to be what he called the arsenal of democracy, to provide the supplies and weapons to defend democracy in Europe and in Asia against the advancing tide of fascism. And A. Philip Randolph and a lot of other civil rights leaders said, well, that's a great idea, but how can you be an arsenal of democracy if black workers are completely shut out of these jobs? The armed forces are segregated, and African Americans are shut out of the officer corps, in some cases completely out of the armed forces. So they initially said, we need to make this March on Washington. He started calling for 100,000 people, or by 10,000 people. He raised it to 50,000 people, 100,000 people. He called it off at the last minute when Roosevelt, convinced that this was going to happen in the middle of preparations for the war, issued an executive order banning employment discrimination by defense contractors during the war. So it was a very temporary measure. And this, I think, in some ways was the beginning of what we would later know as the Civil Rights Movement. And it did a number of things. One, it established A. Philip Randolph as the primary leader of this movement. And through the 1960s, he was known as the Dean of Black Leadership. It also placed that agenda for jobs really at the center of the movement, and the connection between economic justice and racial equality at the center of the movement. I think we often think of the movement as starting with focusing on segregation in the South and expanding perhaps in the late 1960s to talk about economic justice. In many ways, I think that connection was at the beginning, at the center of the movement from the beginning. It also establishes the tactic of mass mobilization, and particularly Gandhian nonviolence. This is the moment when African Americans are looking to the independence movement in India, then colonial India, British colonial India, and taking these strategies of mass mobilization and applying them to a movement that up until then had largely focused on sort of traditional lobbying. The civil rights movement, the NAACP, was very skilled at trying to talk to legislators to try to pass laws, and also to bring cases through the courts. And the most successful case of this was the Brown decision. That was a series of cases that reached the Supreme Court in the early 1950s. So the argument that people could actually change laws and make progress on policy by mobilizing large numbers of people was really at the beginning of a really central argument that A. Philip Randolph was making. He said, if you're going to bring cases through the courts, you should probably be a lawyer, right? If you're going to go talk to legislators, you should be well educated. You should probably be an adult man, given the biases at the time. Mass mobilization is something that anybody can participate in. And the effect of it is not just that you can change policy, but in doing that, you empower people, right? Somebody who's uneducated, a child, can actually think of themselves as an actor and as a historical actor. And very early on, A. Philip Randolph gave speeches and wrote in 1941 about this strategy. And he said, this is why we need to embrace it. And I think it created, what we now recognize as a very successful and powerful mass movement at a time when A. Philip Randolph, even among many black leaders, was seen as a sort of dangerous radical and somebody who didn't really know about politics.
The most dangerous Negro in America.
That's right. That's right.
First black congressman of the era.
That's right. That's right. He was denounced for during preparations for the March on Washington. He was called the most dangerous Negro in America.
Yeah. But before we move past it, though, we all know, we're all very familiar with also the story of Harry Truman desegregating the military after World War II and the credit he gets for that. And so because of that, we know at some level that the military was segregated. But we don't typically know what that actually meant, that African Americans had been expelled from the U.S. Navy in the first years of the 20th century. And by World War II, the only blacks who are in the Navy are messmen and menial workers. Yeah. There are almost no black officers anywhere even with black units in the Army. There are no African Americans in the Army Air Corps, which becomes the Air Force. The level of segregation was intense, and at the same time, something I think Americans understand even less today, but that you explained rather vividly, is the way that the New Deal programs and the National Recovery Act and the other government initiatives to deal with the Depression in the 1930s had been implemented in a way that utterly left African Americans out of the benefits of those things. And so the basis of the anxiety and tension among African Americans at the end of World War II is founded in these very specific and dramatic deprivations from their friend, FDR, because in 32 and 36, those are the first presidential elections that African Americans vote for a Democrat in a big way. But tell us a little bit more about that, and I mean, some specific examples of how that worked.
Right. Well, I think, in some ways, FDR was in a similar situation as Kennedy, that it's sort of sympathetic, but also very reliant on even more reliant on white votes in the South from segregationists, and so he had to be he was balancing this issue. And so as a result, most of all of the New Deal programs, the economic programs of the New Deal, were on the surface racially neutral. But they were racially neutral in a society that was highly racist, right? So and in some cases, really pretty explicitly excluded African Americans. So I mentioned the minimum wage laws. Almost all of the labor laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Wagner Act, which created the collective bargaining rights for industrial workers, these excluded the employment sectors in which African Americans were concentrated. So agriculture, domestic service, public employment, these were all excluded from most of the labor laws. This, again, was not an explicitly, on its surface, was not a racist law. These exclusions were promoted by Southern Democrats who were worried about giving these powers and these privileges to African Americans. So it was behind the scenes very explicitly racist. The more, I think in some ways, the broader effects was also the degree to which these programs did not affect the racial exclusions that were in place already. So housing supports, for example, the GI Bill, for example, giving mortgage supports for returning veterans, didn't say African Americans couldn't have these, but it was almost impossible for African Americans to buy the houses to qualify for these loans. The banks were reluctant to give loans to African Americans, often had explicit policies against giving loans to African Americans. The GI Bill mandated that if you're going to use a GI Bill loan to buy a house, you have to do it with a new house. And new construction was almost all, they actually had titles where it said you're not allowed to sell this to somebody who's not white. So again, the law on its surface was not racist, but it didn't do anything to affect these. This was particularly galling in late 1940 when the United States had not entered the war. It was gearing up to support the war effort in Europe and in Asia, by ramping up production of weapons, machinery, largely subsidized through federal funding. African Americans were almost completely shut out of these jobs. In the airplane industry, for example, there were about 500 African Americans working in the airplane industry that was employing hundreds of thousands of people. For people who had those jobs and their communities, this effort, this arsenal of democracy effectively ended the Great Depression. This created a very tight labor market. It created a situation in which unions, which again, remember, were protected by federal law in their collective bargaining rights, were able to drive up the wages, demand better benefits. This created a situation in which we sort of begin the story, the post-war story of unprecedented economic growth, particularly aiding working class Americans. And African Americans are completely shut out of this.
And so that's why A. Philip Randolph then makes this push in 1941 to say to FDR, we've got to have a piece of that action, and if not, we're going to march on Washington. And there's a similar level of worry about that proposed march as there is in '63.
That's right.
And then FDR issues this order that seems to respond to this demand. And a week before the march, 2 weeks before the march?
A week before
the march, Randolph calls the whole thing off.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really fascinating give and take, because he initially says, I can't respond to you, because if I respond to you, it will look like I'm responding to mass protests and mob action, right? So you need to call the march off first, and then I'll talk to you. And to which they said, well, no, you need to meet our demands, and then we'll call it off. And it's sort of this head-to-head back and forth that ends up with Roosevelt backing down at the last minute. And he issues this order. I think the order is important because it's in some respects because it was so weak. It was an executive emergency war order, so it only had effect during the war. Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, or FEPC, to enforce this order. He gave this FEPC very little money. They basically had enough money to hold sort of high-profile hearings in about 5 or 6 big cities. It wasn't clear what kind of enforcement power, whether they had the ability to deny a contract. They certainly did not have the ability to withdraw an existing contract. Some employers started to argue, well, we've been negotiating these contracts already, so you need to move forward with those negotiations. And then, so it was very wishy-washy. And in effect, what it meant was that it put on a burden on A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph actually caught a lot of flack for calling off the march. A lot of people said, this is nothing. They didn't do anything to address the armed forces issue. Why did you call it off at the last minute? And so it put a lot of burden on him to demonstrate that they could actually get something out of it. So his response was to create what he would start to call the March on Washington movement. And the idea behind this movement was twofold. One was to organize mass protests at these hearings, call attention to the hearings, in a sense, embarrass employers. They wanted to identify people who had been discriminated against, train them in their rights, train them how to testify before these hearings, and it sort of used the hearings as a vehicle for continuing to pressure the administration. The other was to push for permanent national legislation that did not just apply to contractors, but to any employer, including the government. I mean, the government at the time segregated black workers, refused black workers from certain jobs. So they wanted to expand this tremendously. And in some ways, again, I think that initial need to continue the pressure actually turned this into the movement that we would really see blossom in the 1950s and 1960s.
And Randolph pushes, ultimately, it oversimplifies the story, but for 22 years or thereabouts, pushes off and on for a return to this vision of this march that ultimately is fulfilled when he's now becoming an old man and his wife dies in the midst of the planning process and this new generation has emerged.
Right.
Let's go back to August of 1963 and the day on the march and the moment that we do all remember, where King has begun to give his remarks, and I want you to tell the story, but also to tell the part that Mahalia Jackson played, but also, and I don't think you talk about this in the book, the relationship between King and Mahalia in advance of all this, where she's this melodious, wondrous voice dear to him. When he would be stressed at times in this period, he would sometimes have a secretary. He'd say to the secretary, "Get Mahalia on the phone," and she would call Jackson and get her on the phone, and then she would begin singing to him his favorite gospel hymns over the phone to relax him. And so now here we are, August 28, the anniversary of the Emmett Till's lynching. That's one thing we didn't mention, part of the significance of that date. And King's the last of the formal speakers. He begins his speech, and it's actually not particularly carrying the crowd away by some accounts. Yeah. And then what happens?
Well, he throws away his notes. He pushes them aside, and the story is that Mahalia is behind him, saying, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream," and it's, he never talked about this afterwards. So it's not clear whether he even heard her, but people on the stage heard her and feel that he must have known.
Because, but he had given
right.
talked, this phraseology about a dream had been in speeches previously. She had heard a version of one of these once before.
That's right. So when she was saying, "Tell him about the dream," she was referring to a speech that he had actually given repeatedly over the past several years. The first time he gave it was actually to the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO in 1961, in which he breaks into this "I have a dream" refrain. And he used it in that speech to actually touch much more directly on the relationship between the civil rights movement and the labor movement, on economic justice, and the connection to equal equality, to racial equality. He had given, probably the most famous instance of him giving this speech up until then was at a march in Detroit, which in some ways was a kind of test case for the March on Washington. About 100,000 people marched in Detroit earlier. And it's actually, I think, an event that helped to convince Walter Reuther and Roy Wilkins to support the march. And Mahalia Jackson had heard him give that speech. So she knew that this was a speech that he gave very effectively. Apparently, the night before the march, his advisors had told him not to give that speech. They said, "You've given it too many times. It's kind of trite. It won't really work. And you need a really good speech." So they sat down and wrote a really good speech. That actually, I encourage people. I mean, the first half of his speech is very effective, and it does very much, I think, bring up the theme of economic justice and the links to racial equality. He uses the theme of the imagery of a bounce check, a promissory note. To reference the sort of forgotten or lost promise of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a very powerful speech, but I think the delivery of it was not actually achieving what he was there to do, which, again, was to really uplift people and to knock it out of the park with a really profound speech. And that's when he sort of shifts his notes to the side and gives this really tremendous finale to this day-long event in which he, and that's the one that we remember. And it's no mistake that that's why we remember it.
And we don't remember very well the speech given by John Lewis, the youngest person among the speakers and the only one still alive today, whose speech was very critical in some respects of the Kennedy administration, and so critical, in fact, that they objected to it, and there was a behind-the-scenes struggle over whether he would be able to give a speech or how to moderate it. But tell that story, too.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. I mean, and there's a lot of, I think, sort of a mythology around the censoring of his speech by the Kennedy administration, which, as I point out in the book, is not really true. It was the people in the Kennedy administration tried to censor the speech. A number of people objected to his language, using language like the masses, calling for revolution. He explicitly said, "Let's not forget that this is a massive revolution." And people objected to that. Leaders of the march said, particularly Philip Randolph said, I talk about the masses and I talk about revolution all the time. In fact, his speech says this is a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. So he said, we're not going to make him change that. What they did make him change was that John Lewis said that SNCC could not support the Civil Rights Act or the Civil Rights Bill. And they said, that's a really important part of this march. You need to at least support it. So he said, well, we support it with great reservations. And that's actually what the other speakers all said. I mean, even Roy Wilkins, probably the most sort of moderate of the leaders, said he lashed out at Kennedy's bill, saying this is little more than sugar water. It's just, it's really meaningless. We need to make it much stronger. So in that way, John Lewis was in line with the message of the march, and that was because they brought him in line with the message that the bill is not the whole thing, but we want the bill. The other one was a really direct reference to violence. He said, we need to march through the South like Sherman did and burn Jim Crow to the ground nonviolently. And despite the despite the final, qualification, this was actually Bayard Rustin said, look, this is a nonviolent movement, and we can't refer to burning things to the ground. So they asked him to take that out. And he talks about this and says, he doesn't feel like he was censored, that his message came across. And I think, actually, the speech that he gave was tremendously powerful and very radical in its message.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.